The year was 1898. The world watched as the United States, a growing power, fought the Spanish Empire in what became known as the Spanish-American War. The Americans promised freedom to nations under Spain's rule, and one of those nations was the Philippines. Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, believed that after years of fighting Spanish colonizers, freedom was finally within reach. But what happened next would shock the world. The victory over Spain didn't bring freedom, it brought another war. A brutal, bloody, and often forgotten conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. This is the story of the Philippine-American War, the forgotten conflict. After Spain's defeat in 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain handed over control of the Philippines, along with Guam and Puerto Rico, to the United States for $20 million. But the Filipinos had already declared independence in June of that same year. They had a flag, a government, and a president, Emilio Aguinaldo. The Filipino people believed they had won their freedom. The Americans, however, saw the islands as spoils of war. Washington called it benevolent assimilation, a mission to civilize and educate the Filipinos. But behind those words was the truth. The United States wanted control of the Philippines. The tension grew quickly. Filipino forces surrounded Manila, waiting for the Americans to recognize their independence. But the Americans refused to let them enter the city. The uneasy peace didn't last long. On the night of February 4, 1899, an American soldier named Private William Grayson shot a Filipino soldier near the outskirts of Manila. That single gunshot became the spark that set off one of the bloodiest wars in Philippine history. What followed was chaos. Filipino and American troops clashed across Manila. The sound of rifles and cannons filled the air. The Filipinos, brave but poorly equipped, fought desperately for their homeland. They had rifles from the Spanish era and homemade weapons, while the Americans had modern guns, artillery, and warships. By March, the U.S. forces had captured several Filipino strongholds. The dream of independence was slipping away, but Aguinaldo refused to surrender. He declared that the war would continue this time as a guerrilla war. The Americans thought they had won by mid-1899, but they were wrong. What they faced next was an invisible enemy, Filipino fighters blending in with civilians, striking quickly and disappearing into jungles and mountains. It was a war unlike any the Americans had fought before. The U.S. Army responded with brutal tactics. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned. Civilians were forced into reconcentration zones, areas surrounded by barbed wire where disease and hunger spread like wildfire. In some provinces, 1 in every 6 Filipinos died. Reports of massacres and torture reached Washington. One general famously told his troops, "Kill everyone over 10."
The Philippines had traded one colonizer for another. American newspapers called it a success story of civilization, but Filipinos remembered it as the death of their independence. For the United States, the war was the beginning of its rise as a global power. The victory gave America a foothold in Asia, gateway to trade and influence. For the Philippines, it marked decades of colonial rule that would last until World War II. Even then, full independence wouldn't come until 1946, almost half a century after Aguinaldo first raised the flag of a free Philippines. Yet the war was quietly forgotten in American history books. It didn't fit the heroic image the United States wanted to project. Soldiers who fought there called it the Great Mistake. Some wrote letters describing the horrors they had seen: the burning villages, the crying mothers, the piles of corpses, but their voices were buried under patriotic speeches. The American public wanted to move on. For many years, the Philippine-American War was left in the shadows, rarely mentioned, barely studied. It was as if the blood, the suffering, and the courage of millions had simply been erased. But history has a way of resurfacing. Today, more and more historians are uncovering the stories of that forgotten war, the bravery of Filipino fighters, the tragedy of civilians caught in the crossfire, and the moral questions that haunted both sides. Why did a nation born from revolution choose to suppress another nation's revolution? Why did the promise of freedom turn into the shadow of conquest? The Philippine-American War wasn't just a battle between armies, it was a clash of ideals. The Filipinos fought for independence, for the right to govern themselves. The Americans claimed they were bringing democracy, but in truth, They were building an empire. The contradiction was clear even to some Americans at the time. Famous figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie spoke out against the war. Twain said, "We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem." But his words, like the voices of the dead, were drowned out by the march of empire. Despite the loss, the spirit of the Filipino Revolution never truly died. It lived on in the hearts of the next generations, those who would later fight against Japanese occupation, and those who would finally achieve independence in 1946. The Philippine-American War became a painful but powerful chapter in the story of a nation that refused to be silenced. Today, when we look back at the war, we see more than just battles and dates. We see courage and betrayal, hope and heartbreak, freedom and loss. It reminds us that history is not always clean or fair. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are those whose names we never learn. The farmers who hid soldiers in their barns, the mothers who carried messages across enemy lines, the young boys who fought with nothing but determination and courage.
They were the soul of the revolution, the proof that freedom can never truly be conquered. As the 20th century began, the world changed. Empires fell, new nations rose, and the Philippines slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes. But the scars of that war remain. In the ruins of old battlefields, in the fading letters of soldiers, and in the memories passed down through families, the story continues to whisper, "We fought for freedom. We did not forget." The Philippine-American War may not be as famous as other wars, but its lessons are timeless. It warns us about the cost of empire, the pain of lost independence, and the resilience of a people who refuse to surrender. It shows us that history is not only written by the victors, it lives in the memories of those who endured it. More than a century later, the story still matters. It is a reminder to the world that freedom is never given, it is fought for. And though the war ended in 1902, the spirit of that struggle still burns in the heart of every Filipino who values independence and justice. The Philippine-American War was not just a forgotten conflict. It was a turning point that shaped two nations, the United States, stepping into the age of empire, and the Philippines standing at the dawn of its long and painful journey toward true freedom. And while history may have tried to bury it, the voices of those who fought still echo across time, telling us one thing: no matter how powerful the conqueror, the dream of freedom can never be silenced. So, the next time you hear about the great wars of history, remember the one that was almost erased. Remember the men and women who stood up against impossible odds. Remember the forgotten war, the war that changed the Philippines forever. This was not just the story of a conflict, it was the story of a people's unbreakable will to be free. What do you think about the growing U.S. military presence in the Philippines? Some say it's a sign of strength and protection, a move to keep peace in the West Philippine Sea. Others worrying it could increase tensions and pull the country into a bigger conflict. Do you believe this alliance will bring peace and security, or make the region more dangerous? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. I read and reply to as many as I can. Don't forget to subscribe, and share to keep others informed about what's really happening in the West Philippine Sea. Together, let's keep the discussion alive and the truth visible.